1896. Jew Theodor Herzl founded the Zionist movement. The goal was to bring the Jews back to Israel after hundreds of years. In 1917, the British government showed clear interest in creating a Jewish homeland in the land that once was Israel. In November of that year, the British wrote the Balfour Declaration. The British clearly intended to create a Jewish homeland. It read, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." Years later, on November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly, now in control to the rights of the land of Israel, voted 33-13 to split the land of Israel into two nations, Israel and Palestine. The Zionists accepted, and the Palestinians declined because they felt the land should go to themselves. About a year later, on May 14, 1948, in front of a Jewish community in Palestine in the Tel Aviv Art Museum, David Ben-Gurion read out a Jewish Declaration of Independence to create the State of Israel. The declaration promised equal rights to Arabs and peace to neighboring Arab nations. Equal rights no matter what sex, religion, or race. June 2, 1964, the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, formed. The PLO planned to win the land of Israel all for themselves. The PLO convinced Egypt, Jordan, and Syria to fight Israel and get the land back for the Palestinians. On June 5, 1967, the Six-Day War began. Before the Six-Day War even began, Egyptian President Gamal Nasser had previously threatened Israel. King Hussein of Jordan had placed his troops under Nasser's command to fight Israel. On the first day of the war, Israel launched an attack and destroyed 90% of Egypt's air force and caused significant damage to Syria's air force. Without air defense, the Jews quickly took over the Palestinian-occupied Gaza Strip. On June 7th, the Jews pushed the Jordanian forces out of East Jerusalem, securing the city of Jerusalem and the Palestinian-occupied West Bank. That same day, the UN called for a ceasefire. The US and Jordan immediately accepted. Egypt accepted the next day, and Syria eventually accepted June 10th. The death toll from the Six-Day War was catastrophic. 18,000 Jordans, Egyptians, and Syrians passed away, and only 700 Jews died. Their victory resulted in them taking the Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Sinai Peninsula. After defeat by Israel after the 1967 Six-Day War, the new Egyptian president Anwar el-Sadat wished to attack Israel again, because he thought if he tried to make peace, the terms would be unfavorable to Egypt. On Yom Kippur, October 6, 1973, Egyptian and Syrian forces both attacked Israel, surprising the Israelis and starting the Yom Kippur War. After 7 days of war, U.S. President Richard Nixon aided Israel by providing an airlift of arms. The U.S. later secured a ceasefire in November. Although the Egyptians lost the Yom Kippur War, their initial success gave them an edge in the search for peace. Thus, in 1974, Egypt began peace negotiations with Israel. In 1978, U.S. President Jimmy Carter invited Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menahem into his Camp David retreat location to talk out peace accords. Finally, on September 17, 1978, at the White House, Egyptian President Anwar el-Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menahem signed the first of the Camp David Accords. The final arrangements were signed March 1979. Thanks to the Camp David Accords, the Sinai Peninsula was now occupied by Egypt once again. The Western world seemed pleased with Sadat and his actions during the Camp David Accords, as he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Unfortunately, the Arab community despised Sadat and Egypt for their newfound peace with Israel. In 1979, Anwar el-Sadat was assassinated by extremists during a parade remembering the Yom Kippur War. While peace negotiations went over well with the Egyptians and Israelis, the same can't be said for the Israelis and Palestinians. On December 9, 1987, the Intifada, or Palestinian Uprising, began. In the Israeli-occupied Gaza Strip, an Israeli truck crashed into a station wagon of Palestinian workers. Gaza Palestinians saw this as an act of violence towards them. Protests erupted. Trees burned. Rocks were thrown at Israeli police. In Jabalia, an Israeli army patrol car fired at protesters, killing a 17-year-old and injuring 16 others. Riots against Israelis steadily increased throughout the year. Palestinian despair exploded. Palestinian leaders formed the Unified National Command of the Uprising, which had ties to the PLO, who wanted to liberate the Palestinians. The mission of the National Command was for Palestinian self-rule. In December of 1988, PLO leader Yasser Arafat shocked the world by claiming Israel had a right to exist, and he authorized a peace agreement with Israel. Later on in 1933, new Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin vowed to move quickly with the peace process. The Intifada was called off. Israel and Palestine moved towards peace. The day was September 13th, 1933. The Oslo Accords were signed by Yitzhak Rabin of Israel and Yasser Arafat of the PLO in front of the White House. Unfortunately, almost nothing came out of the Oslo Accords. Both parties felt they did not receive what they really wanted from Oslo. Although it was not agreed to, the Palestinians expected Israel to slowly exit from the Gaza Strip and West Bank. The Israelis denied this because they wanted control of the Gaza Strip and West Bank. Without their control, they worried the Palestinians would try to overthrow Israel. The Oslo Accords also allowed for a creation of a Palestinian Authority that would govern the Gaza Strip and parts of the West Bank. Israelis began to fear the Palestinian Authority because with that many Palestinians with weapons, they may just overthrow the Israeli government. And that is where the conflict stands today. There is still endless conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Morris Barzilai, rabbi at Sinai Free Synagogue in Mount Vernon. I'm a believer in a bi-state solution. The question of who has the right to the land is a complicated one. Again, certainly there was a UN resolution in 1947 and 1948 that called for a two-state solution. The Jews accepted that and declared independence over the land that they had control of. The Arab population, the so-called Palestinians, did not accept that, and a war broke out over that. So I think both have certain rights and need to come up with a solution that can help both sides. Ideally, the solution has to be between the two peoples, the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. They have shown that they're not capable of coming up with a plan. This situation has lasted so long. So I think intervention or encouragement from the superpowers and other countries can be helpful in brokering a deal. Ultimately, the decision has to be between the two parties, and it's, again, something that's going to take a willingness to trust, to compromise, and having other people help in that process can be beneficial. But ultimately, the two sides intimately involved have to be the ones to come to an agreement. We have to maintain hope and a willingness to keep trying. Both sides need to be willing to listen and to compromise.
Overall, the Camp David Accords should have set an example for Oslo. It was directly signed in the Camp David Accords that Israel was supposed to simply exit the Sinai Peninsula, and it was to become Egypt's land. This happened, and peace reigns today. Unfortunately, Oslo did not follow in the footsteps of Camp David. Instead of giving the Palestinians complete control of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, they gave about 60% out of fear of being overthrown. Without this fear, peace could have been found. Israelis illegally settle in the West Bank and Gaza Strip constantly. The Palestinian Authority hasn't done much to help the Palestinians live better lives economically. Many Palestinians and Israelis wish the Palestinian Authority would just die off and become part of Israel. Experts say the days of the Palestinian Authority are numbered, and Oslo was a complete failure from the start.